The train screeched to a halt in the dead of night, its whistle tearing through the silence like a blade. I stepped onto the platform of Hollow Creek, and the first thing I noticed was the cold, not the ordinary kind of winter chill, but a heavy, unnatural cold that seemed to cling to the bones, as though the town itself rejected warmth. My breath fogged in front of me, but the air felt wrong, stale, metallic, almost like rusted iron. I had been summoned by letter, the words shaky and desperate. "Please come, we don't know what else to do. It's Timothy." The platform was nearly empty, save for a few shadowed figures who stood far enough away to keep their distance. Their faces were pale and drawn tight, their eyes darting from me as if looking directly at me might bring some kind of curse. One man, hunched and weather-beaten, paused long enough to offer a single warning. "Best you turn back, doctor," he rasped, his voice dry as brittle leaves. "Ain't nothing here for you but grief." Before I could respond, he melted into the mist, vanishing between the rows of shuttered houses that lined the edge of town. I told myself it was nothing but superstition, the fear of simple folk clinging to their old beliefs. Still, his words stayed with me, like a splinter buried too deep to pull free. A horse-drawn carriage waited at the far end of the platform, its driver hunched forward beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He didn't greet me, didn't even look at me, only muttered Caldwell Estate when I gave my destination. The carriage jolted forward, its wheels rattling along the uneven road, and I watched Hollow Creek slip past in pieces, houses with boarded windows, empty streets swallowed by fog, and a silence so heavy it seemed to press against my chest. No voices, no laughter, not even the barking of a dog. This was a place where sound had died a long time ago. The road to the Caldwell Estate was worse. It cut through an ancient forest where the trees leaned inward, their gnarled branches knitting together overhead, until they blotted out the moonlight. It felt as if we were passing into another world, one that had no business existing alongside the living. Halfway through, the driver spoke for the first and only time. "Don't look at him too long," he said, his voice trembling. "Changes you." I turned to question him, but he only tightened his grip on the reins until his knuckles went bone white. When I pressed again, he spat into the frost and muttered, "Eyes that don't belong to no child." When the Caldwell Estate finally came into view, it rose out of the fog like a blackened wound on the horizon. The house was massive but wrong, its frame warped as if it had been built to lean away from the world around it. The windows stared outward like dead eyes, empty and lightless. It didn't look abandoned, but it didn't look alive either, more like something caught between the two. As I stared, I felt a chill run down my spine, the kind of chill you don't shake off. That was when I saw it. In one of the upper windows, just for a second, I thought I saw a figure, small, thin, too still. A boy. He stood motionless, his head tilted at an angle no human neck should allow, and though the distance was great, I could swear his eyes met mine. I blinked, and he was gone. The driver pulled the carriage to a sudden stop. "We're here," he muttered sharply, his voice thin with fear. "I won't wait for you." Before I could respond, he snapped the reins, and the horses bolted back into the fog, leaving me alone at the rusted gates of the estate. I gripped the iron handle, my fingers trembling from more than just the cold. Somewhere in the house, faint and distant, I heard it, a soft, steady tapping, like small fingers drumming against wood. I told myself it was the wind. I told myself a lot of things, and then I pushed the gate open. The air changed the moment I stepped onto the property. It felt heavier, as if the world itself was holding its breath. That was when I realized the truth. Timothy Caldwell was waiting for me, and whatever he was, he wasn't just a boy. The Caldwell Estate loomed larger as I approached, its blackened walls rising against the fog, like the remains of something long dead. The iron gate groaned shut behind me, and for the first time, I realized how quiet it was. No crickets, no wind through the trees, not even the distant hum of Hollow Creek's main road. It was as if sound itself refused to cross onto this land. As I reached the front steps, I found myself staring at the door, at the faded brass knocker shaped like a serpent eating its own tail. I had seen this emblem before, in old medical texts and forgotten journals. It was a symbol associated not with healing, but with secrets. I rapped the knocker once. The echo carried far longer than it should have, bouncing against the stillness in a way that made my skin crawl. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened just enough for a thin, pale woman to emerge from the shadows within. Her hair was streaked white despite her youth, and her hands trembled as if she had lived too long in fear. "You came," she whispered, her voice trembling. Thank God. I recognized her immediately from the letter. Eliza Caldwell, Timothy's mother. Her eyes darted past me, scanning the fog as if to make certain nothing had followed. Without another word she ushered me inside, and the door slammed shut behind us with the weight of a prison gate. The interior of the house was worse than I expected. The walls were lined with portraits of the Caldwell lineage, each face grim and sharp-eyed, painted in tones so dark it seemed as if the shadows had bled into the canvas. The smell was peculiar too. Stale wood mixed with something faintly coppery, like old blood. Eliza noticed my discomfort and spoke before I could ask. "This house has been ours for generations," she said, leading me down a hallway where the gas lamps flickered, as if disturbed by a draft that wasn't there. "My husband's family built Hollow Creek. They owned the land before there was a town." But, her voice faltered, and for a moment she looked as if she might break. "The Caldwells have always been different." We stopped in front of a set of heavy oak doors at the end of the corridor. She didn't open them. Instead, she turned to me, her eyes hollow, her voice nearly a whisper. "They say our bloodline is cursed. My grandfather was born with a second heart. My aunt, she lived 30 years and never grew a single hair on her head. And Timothy," she hesitated, her gaze falling to the floor. "Timothy is worse than all of them." Before I could speak, a noise cut through the house. It wasn't loud, just a slow, deliberate tapping sound, like fingernails on glass. It came from above us, from the second floor. Eliza closed her eyes, pressing her fingers to her lips. "He's awake," she whispered, and her voice was almost reverent, as though she were speaking of a god she both worshipped and feared. I followed her as she led me into the sitting room. There by the firelight, I saw a series of old newspaper clippings pinned to the wall, birth records, death notices, headlines about unexplained tragedies, each one linked in some way to the Caldwell family. A photograph of Timothy was among them. He looked no older than 12, but his eyes, they didn't belong to a child. They were sharp, unblinking, and cold, like something ancient wearing the shape of a boy. I stared too long. Eliza grabbed my wrist suddenly, her grip like iron. "Don't," she hissed. "Don't look at him for too long. That's how it starts." And then, from upstairs, I heard it again, this time louder. The tapping was no longer steady. It was deliberate. Eliza led me up the staircase with slow, hesitant steps, her hand trembling on the railing as though the house itself might notice if we moved too quickly. Each step groaned beneath our weight, the sound sharp in the suffocating silence. The tapping from above had stopped now, replaced by something worse, an expectant stillness, like the quiet before a storm. Halfway up, I felt it, a strange pressure in the air, a heaviness that settled over my chest, as if unseen eyes were pressing down on me. We reached a long hallway, lined with doors. Every one of them was shut, save for the one at the very end. It was slightly ajar, and from within came the faint smell of something I could not place, sweet and sour, like spoiled fruit left in a sealed room. Eliza paused in front of the door, her fingers tightening around the knob, but she didn't push it open. Instead, she turned to me with a look so sharp it felt like a warning carved into my bones. "You'll want to be careful," she whispered. "He knows when he's being watched." Before I could ask what she meant, the door creaked wider on its own. My heart stumbled in my chest. The room was dark except for a thin shaft of moonlight filtering through the window, and there he was. Timothy Caldwell sat in the corner on a small wooden chair, perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees. He did not blink. His skin was pale to the point of translucence, stretched thin over sharp bones, and his head tilted just slightly to one side in a way no ordinary child would hold it. But it was his eyes that froze me in place. They were impossibly dark, black in a way that seemed to drink the light out of the room. They didn't wander or dart like a child's should. They fixed on me instantly, unblinking, sharp as broken glass. I should have looked away. God help me. I couldn't. The longer I stared, the heavier the air became, as if the room itself was collapsing inward. My ears rang. My throat tightened, and then, without moving his lips, Timothy smiled. It was not the kind of smile that belonged to a boy. It was thin, deliberate, and knowing, like something wearing a child's face had finally been recognized. Eliza's hand shot to my shoulder, snapping me out of the trance. "Enough," she hissed, dragging me back a step. The spell, if that's what it was, broke. Timothy's head tilted further, his neck bending at an angle that made my stomach churn. He didn't move toward us. He didn't speak. He only tapped one finger against the arm of the chair, slow and steady, in perfect rhythm with my heartbeat. I stumbled back, and Eliza pulled me into the hall, slamming the door shut behind us. She pressed her back to it, chest heaving as though we'd just outrun a fire. "Never hold his gaze," she warned, her voice hoarse. "If you do, you'll see it too." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "See what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Her eyes glistened in the dim lamplight. "Whatever he really is," she whispered. From the other side of the door, the tapping resumed, faster now, sharper, like he was laughing at us in his own silent way. And for the first time since I arrived in Hollow Creek, I realized this was not just an illness. This was something far worse. I could not shake the weight of his stare, even after Eliza dragged me down the hall and back into the sitting room. My hands trembled as I poured myself a glass of water from a chipped decanter on the table, but it tasted of iron, as though the house had tainted it. I set it down untouched. Timothy's image lingered in my mind. His hollow frame, that unnatural tilt of his head, and those eyes, blacker than any void I'd ever known. But what unsettled me most was the silence. Not once in that long, dreadful encounter had he spoken a word. I asked Eliza if he ever did. She lowered herself into a chair near the fire, her face pale in the flickering light. "No," she said softly, shaking her head. "Not a sound. Not since the day he was born." I stared at her, disbelieving. "But he was an infant," I argued. "Surely he must have cried." Eliza's lips quivered with something between shame and fear. "Not once. We thought he was different, but harmless, until he turned 5. She rose to her feet and moved toward a locked cabinet against the wall. From it she withdrew a small wooden box and placed it before me. Inside were scraps of paper, each one filled with crude, childlike drawings. They were disturbing, ink-black figures with elongated limbs, crude shapes of houses without windows, and a recurring symbol that sent a chill down my spine, a circle of jagged lines, almost like teeth. "He draws them," Eliza whispered, "every day, over and over. He never speaks, never writes words, just these." I held one of the drawings closer to the firelight, and something about it struck me. These were not the clumsy scribbles of a child. The shapes had purpose. The teeth-like circle was perfectly proportioned, repeated exactly the same on every page, as though Timothy wasn't merely doodling, but recording something. I asked Eliza if she had ever shown these to anyone outside the family. She laughed bitterly, the sound short and sharp. "The last doctor we brought here left before sundown. He wouldn't even look at Timothy a second time. That was when I heard it again, the tapping, slow, deliberate, from upstairs. Eliza didn't even flinch. "He does that when he knows you're thinking about him," she murmured, her voice so low I almost didn't catch it. I glanced toward the ceiling, my skin crawling. There was no question in my mind anymore. Timothy was aware of us, even through walls, even without sound. I stood, determination rising despite the unease in my chest. "If he will not speak, I'll find another way to understand him," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I realized how hollow they sounded. Eliza only gave me a look that might have been pity, or perhaps warning. Then, as if in answer, the tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the sound. It pressed against my ears, until I felt dizzy. Then faintly, from above, came something new. A sound so small, I almost doubted it was real. It was a whisper, thin and rasping, like breath sliding through a cracked door. Not words, just a single broken syllable, repeated twice. Eliza went rigid. Her hands clutched the arms of her chair, until her knuckles turned white. "Don't answer him," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "Not tonight. Not ever." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I only listened. And as the whispering faded, I realized something far worse than silence had begun. That night, I stayed in one of the guest rooms on the second floor of the Caldwell estate. Eliza lit a single oil lamp for me, and left without another word, her footsteps retreating down the hall, until they were swallowed by the stillness. The silence in that house was unlike anything I had ever known. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was something deeper, heavier, as if the walls themselves smothered any noise that dared to exist. Even the crackle of the lamp's flame seemed muted, as though the house wanted me to hear only one thing: the faint, deliberate tapping that came from Timothy's room down the hall. I tried to distract myself by unpacking my medical case, arranging my instruments in a neat row on the bedside table, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. Each metallic clink of my tools against the wood felt too loud, like I was breaking some unspoken rule. At one point I paused and held my breath, just listening. That was when I realized it. The tapping had stopped. For a moment relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by something worse. In its place came a sound so faint, I thought it might be my imagination. Slow, careful footsteps just beyond my door. I turned toward the sound, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped when I moved. The silence returned, deeper now, pressing into my skull, until I could hear my own pulse. I forced myself to speak, just to hear something human. "Who's there?" My voice was swallowed by the room, barely more than a whisper. No answer came, only the creak of the floorboards, one step, then another, passing my door, and continuing down the hall toward Timothy's room. Sleep was impossible. I lay down fully clothed, the lamp still burning, and stared at the ceiling. My mind wandered back to Timothy's eyes, black and endless, and the way he had smiled without moving his mouth. I told myself it was only exhaustion, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again, something soft and deliberate brushing against the other side of my door. Not footsteps this time, not tapping, just a presence. Slowly, I rose from the bed, every instinct screaming at me to stay where I was. I stepped toward the door, and placed my ear against it. The wood was cold, unnaturally so. At first I heard nothing, then very faintly, came a sound I will never forget. A single drawn-out breath, not mine, not human. I stumbled back, my hand trembling as I reached for the lamp. The flame flickered violently, and for an instant, the room seemed darker than it should have been, as though the shadows were alive and shifting at the edges of the light. Then, without warning, it stopped. The silence returned, so sudden and complete, it felt almost purposeful, like the house itself had exhaled. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat upright in the chair by the window, gripping the lamp until dawn bled gray across the sky. Only then did I dare open the door. The hallway was empty. No footprints on the dusty wood. No sign that anything or anyone had been there. But as I turned to retreat into my room, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. On the floor just outside my door, drawn in thin childlike scratches, was a small circle of jagged lines, the same symbol from Timothy's drawings, and in that moment, I understood Timothy didn't need to leave his room to reach me. By morning, I tried convincing myself it had been exhaustion, and nothing more, but the symbol carved outside my door told a different story. I studied it under the pale light of dawn, thin, jagged scratches etched deep into the wood, far too precise for any child to have drawn with his bare hands. Yet I knew Timothy had done it. Somehow, in the suffocating silence of that house, he had left his mark on my door without ever stepping foot outside his room. I resolved then to treat this as I would any other case, with reason. I was a physician, trained to understand what others could not. Madness was an illness. Fear was a symptom. And even Timothy Caldwell must have an explanation that could be measured, studied, and proven. I set up my desk in the sitting room, spreading out my journals, instruments, and blank sheets of paper. If I could observe him as a doctor, perhaps I could silence the part of me that whispered that I was dealing with something far worse. Eliza hovered near the doorway, watching me with hollow eyes. "You can write your reports if it makes you feel better," she said softly, almost pitying, "but it won't change what he is." I ignored her. I recorded everything: Timothy's age, height, weight. I noted his unnaturally pale skin, his refusal to eat anything solid, the absence of any vocalization. I wrote it all down in neat clinical lines, but the more I wrote, the more it felt wrong. Every symptom defied medicine. His pulse, when I placed my fingers to his wrist, was slow, too slow, barely 30 beats a minute. His skin was cold, not with fever or shock, but as if the warmth of life had never touched him at all. When I tried to examine his eyes, I made the mistake of looking into them for longer than I intended. For a moment I felt myself sinking. The room blurred around me. It was like staring down into a well so deep that no light could reach the bottom. I tore my gaze away, gasping, my chest tight, and when I looked at Timothy again, his mouth had curled into that same thin smile. He hadn't moved a muscle, but I swear I heard it then, a sound soft and wet, deep in the back of his throat. Not a word, not a laugh, something in between. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. Eliza caught my arm before I could fall. "Don't," she whispered sharply. "He likes it when you listen too closely." Her voice trembled, but it carried a weight that silenced me. I wanted to argue, but when I turned back toward Timothy, he was still in his chair, motionless, staring through me, as if I were nothing but a shadow passing in front of him. I returned to my notes, my pen trembling in my hand. I wrote the truth, though I didn't want to see it on the page. Timothy Caldwell cannot be explained by science. That night, I locked my door and pushed a chair against it. I told myself it was only precaution, but I could feel his presence even then, pressing in from down the hall. And when I finally dared to glance at my journal again, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. At the bottom of the page, below my handwriting, was a small circle of jagged lines. I hadn't drawn it. I didn't sleep, not truly. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt them, his eyes staring at me from somewhere in the dark, as if distance and walls were meaningless to Timothy Caldwell. By morning I sat at my desk with a lamp burning low, my journal open in front of me. The circle of jagged lines was still there at the bottom of the page, mocking me. I didn't remember drawing it. I didn't even remember holding my pen, after I had finished writing the night before, and yet it was carved into the paper with the same precision I had seen in Timothy's drawings. I decided I could no longer rely on second-hand observation. If I was to understand him, truly understand him, I would have to look into his eyes again. A dangerous thought, I knew, but I convinced myself it was scientific. Fear was an obstacle, not a diagnosis. So I made my way down the hall, each step creaking under my weight. As I approached Timothy's room, the door was already ajar, just as it had been the first night I saw him. Inside, the boy sat exactly as before, small, pale, impossibly still. His hands rested on his knees, his head tilted slightly, as if frozen in some unnatural curiosity. But the moment I entered, those eyes found me. They didn't wander or blink. They fixed on me as though I had been expected, as though I was merely stepping into a role he had already written for me. I forced myself closer, each step heavier than the last. His pupils, if they could even be called that, were pits of absolute black, so deep I felt as though I might fall in and never return. I couldn't help it. I stared. The longer I looked, the more I saw. Shapes, faint, shifting things, moved in that darkness. A hand too long to be human. A mouth that opened wider than any mouth should. And behind them a shadow that had no form at all, only hunger. The room spun. My chest tightened. My legs locked in place. I could not move, could not breathe. And then from somewhere far away, I heard it, a faint sound, like the scrape of nails on glass. Timothy was smiling again. Eliza's voice cut through the trance like a knife. She grabbed my shoulder and yanked me back so violently, I stumbled into the hallway, my lungs filled with air. I hadn't realized I was missing. "You fool," she hissed, slamming the door shut between us and him. "You never look for too long. That's how he gets in." I stared at her, trembling. What did I see? My voice was ragged, barely my own. She didn't answer. She only closed her eyes and whispered, the same thing I saw the first time I looked, the thing that's wearing my son's face. From behind the door, a soft sound rose, not tapping, not whispering. This was different. A quiet, deliberate knock, 3 times, slow, rhythmic. Eliza backed away from the door, pulling me with her. "He wants you to come back," she murmured, and for the briefest moment, I felt an ache in my chest, a pull, as though something in those black eyes had followed me into the hallway and was waiting for me to open the door again. By the next morning, I needed air that didn't taste like the inside of the Caldwell house. I left the estate under the pale gray light of dawn and followed the dirt road back into Hollow Creek. The town was nearly silent, its streets empty, its windows shuttered, but I knew the people were there. I could feel them watching from behind curtains, their fear woven into every creak of the old wooden boards beneath my boots. I stopped first at the general store, the only place in town with a door left unlocked. The shopkeeper was an older man with a crooked back and sunken eyes, his hands trembling slightly as he weighed a bag of coffee beans for me. When I asked him about Timothy Caldwell, he froze. His gaze flicked up to mine, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, in a voice as dry as the dust that lined his shelves, he said, "Best you keep your distance, doctor. That boy, he ain't right." I pressed him for more, lowering my voice so no one else could hear. The man leaned closer, his breath sharp with tobacco. "I saw him once," he whispered. 2 years back. Walked past him on the road. He was staring at me, and God help me, I stared back. His hands trembled harder now, spilling a few beans onto the counter. Felt like he was inside my head. Couldn't think, couldn't move. By the time I looked away, I didn't feel like myself no more. Haven't since. He didn't meet my eyes again. Instead, he shoved the bag of coffee toward me and muttered, "You'd do well to leave that house before he decides he likes you." Outside, I found a group of women drawing water from the well. When I approached, they fell silent. One of them, her hair tied back in a tight knot, finally spoke. "You're staying with the Caldwells, aren't you?" she asked. I nodded. Her mouth tightened. "Then you best pray," she said simply, and turned away. Another woman, younger, couldn't hold her tongue. "My brother saw him once," she said in a low voice. "Came home that night, and tore every mirror out of the house. Said he couldn't stand to look at himself no more. Said his reflection looked wrong." Her words sent a chill through me, but before I could ask anything more, the older woman snapped at her to hush. The group dispersed quickly, casting nervous glances toward the road that led to the estate, as though speaking Timothy's name too many times might summon him. I spent the rest of the afternoon wandering through Hollow Creek, searching for answers. Every person I spoke to gave me fragments: a farmer who swore his livestock bolted if Timothy came near, a schoolteacher who claimed the boy never cast a shadow on sunny days, an old drunk who muttered about the black-eyed devil in that cursed house. No one spoke for long. No one ever stayed near me, once they realized where I was lodging. By the time I returned to the Caldwell estate, the sun had sunk low, bleeding red across the horizon. I paused at the gate, my mind heavy with the stories I had gathered. None of them could be proven. None of them could be explained, and yet, every word carried the weight of truth. As I placed my hand on the rusted gate, I looked back once more at Hollow Creek. Dozens of curtains fluttered as they were drawn shut in unison. Not a soul would watch me enter that house. No one dared, and in that moment, I understood I was entirely alone with him. That night, the air in the Caldwell estate felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I sat in the study, reviewing my scattered notes by lamplight, but the words blurred together until they were nothing more than meaningless lines of ink. My thoughts kept circling back to the whispers I had heard in town, the fear in their voices, the way they shut their curtains as I returned to the house. I told myself I was still in control of my reason, that I could separate fear from fact. But then the tapping began again. It started softly, as it always did, from Timothy's room down the hall. 3 slow taps. Then silence. I froze, pen trembling in my hand. Another 3 taps followed, louder this time, sharp enough to echo against the wood-paneled walls. I rose from my chair, compelled against my better judgment, and opened the door to the hallway. The tapping stopped the instant I stepped out, leaving nothing but silence, so thick I could hear my own breathing. I should have turned back. I should have locked my door, but instead, I found myself drawn toward Timothy's room. His door was closed, but a thin strip of light bled out from beneath it, unnatural and pale, almost silver in color. I reached out and touched the handle. It was cold, colder than the air around it, like it had been left out in the dead of winter. And then, without warning, the door swung open. Timothy was standing in the center of the room, not sitting, not watching from his usual corner, standing, his head tilted slightly, his arms hanging limply at his sides, his eyes fixed on me. Immediately, 2 pits of blackness that swallowed the faint moonlight from the window. And then, without so much as a sound, every lamp in the hallway behind me went out. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. My body felt rooted to the floor, as though his gaze alone had bound me there. I could hear something, a low hum, faint at first, but growing louder, until it became a vibration in my bones. Timothy didn't move. He didn't have to. The hum was coming from him. Then it happened. The mirror on the far wall cracked. No hands touched it. No object struck it. Spiderweb fractures simply bloomed across the glass, splitting my reflection into a dozen jagged pieces. My breath caught in my throat, and then slowly, every broken shard turned black. Eliza appeared behind me, her hand gripping my shoulder so tightly, I nearly cried out. "Don't look," she hissed. She dragged me backward into the hall, slamming the door shut before I could see anything more. My legs gave out, and I collapsed against the wall, my chest heaving like I'd run for miles. Eliza knelt beside me, her voice trembling. "You saw it, didn't you? Just a piece of it. I couldn't answer. All I could see were those black shards, and in each one, the faint outline of Timothy's smile. From the other side of the door, the tapping resumed. This time it wasn't slow, it was frantic, deliberate, almost mocking. And in that moment, I realized something horrifying. Timothy hadn't just been watching me, he was playing with me. After the incident with the mirror, I could no longer deny the truth. Whatever Timothy was, he was no ordinary child. Yet even as dread gnawed at the edges of my mind, a different instinct took hold: curiosity. There had to be more hidden in that house, something the Caldwells had never told me. I waited until dawn, when the house was at its quietest, and rose from my bed determined to find it. The upper floor of the estate was a maze of narrow corridors and heavy oak doors, most of which were locked tight. Dust blanketed the handles, and the air smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic, like rust or old blood. I ran my hand along the walls as I walked, feeling the strange unevenness beneath the wallpaper, as though entire sections of the house had been rebuilt or covered up. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, until the silence felt almost alive, listening for me. I stopped in front of a door, unlike the others. Its wood was darker, nearly black, and reinforced with iron bolts. The lock was massive, far too heavy for a bedroom. I knelt to inspect it, and that was when I noticed the scratches, hundreds of them, long and jagged, etched deep into the wood. Some were high, far higher than any child could reach. My stomach tightened. Behind me, the floor creaked. I spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there, only the stale air and the faint hum of the house itself. I turned back to the door and pressed my ear against it. At first, there was nothing. Then faintly, so faintly, I almost doubted it, came the sound of breathing. "Eliza," I called later, my voice tight. "What's in that room?" She didn't meet my eyes. Her hands tightened around the hem of her dress, until her knuckles turned white. "That room is not for you," she said sharply. "You'll leave it alone if you want to keep your mind." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The way she said it only deepened my resolve. That night, after the house had gone still, and the only sound was the familiar tapping from Timothy's room, I crept back into the hallway with a lantern and a set of tools I had brought with me from town. The lock was old, but not impenetrable. It yielded, after several long breathless minutes. The door groaned as it opened, releasing a gust of air so cold it burned my lungs. Inside was darkness, but not the kind born from absence of light. This was thicker, heavier, almost physical. I raised the lantern, and what it revealed made my skin crawl. The walls were covered in the same jagged circle symbols Timothy drew over and over again, carved deep into the wood as if by countless desperate hands. In the center of the room stood a single wooden chair. On it sat a bundle of ropes, frayed and stained, as though someone had once been bound there. The floorboards beneath were warped and splintered, as if something had fought to escape. And in the far corner, faint and pale, was a single child-sized handprint burned into the wall. Before I could move closer, a sound came from the hallway behind me, a slow, steady tapping. I turned, my lantern trembling in my grip. Timothy was standing in the doorway. He didn't smile, he didn't blink. He only stared, his head tilted, his black eyes swallowing the light. And then, without a sound, the door slammed shut between us. Eliza found me the next morning, sitting in the study, my hands still trembling from what I had seen in that locked room. I hadn't slept. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that burned handprint in the wall, as if it were seared not just into the wood but into my mind. When she entered, her face was pale and tight, as though she already knew where I had been. "You opened it," she said quietly, not a question but an accusation. I didn't answer. I only stared at her, waiting for her to explain what I had found. For a long moment she stood in silence, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her dress, and then, as if some invisible weight had broken her, she sat down across from me and began to speak. "Timothy was never meant to live," she said, her voice trembling. "When I was carrying him, the doctors told me he wouldn't survive the birth. He wasn't growing right. His heart, it didn't sound like a heart at all." She swallowed hard, and her hands clenched tighter. "The night he came into this world," the midwife screamed. She swore there was a shadow in the room, before he even drew his first breath, but he did. He lived, and from that moment on, nothing in this house was ever the same. I leaned forward. "And the room?" I asked. "The ropes, the symbols." Eliza closed her eyes, as if the memories themselves pained her. "My husband Thomas. He believed Timothy wasn't ours. Not really. He said the boy was wrong, that he brought something into our home that should never have been born. When Timothy was 5, Thomas tried to restrain him. That room was supposed to keep him from changing things." I felt my stomach twist. "And did it?" Her answer was a hollow laugh, sharp and bitter, for a time. "But you can't lock away what isn't human. Not forever. Thomas, he didn't last. One morning, I found him in that room. His eyes were black, just like Timothy's. He'd carved that circle into the walls with his own hands until his fingers bled. When I tried to speak to him, he laughed." Her voice cracked. "And then he hung himself from the beams." A chill ran down my spine. "Why didn't you leave?" I demanded. Eliza's gaze snapped to mine, and for a moment there was a wildness in her eyes. "Leave," she echoed. "You think this place would let us go? He wouldn't allow it. This house is his now. Every board, every nail, it answers to him." I stared at her, my throat dry. "And the townsfolk, they know," she whispered. "That's why they keep their distance. They've seen what happens to those who come too close." Her voice grew even quieter, trembling with fear. "And now you've looked into his eyes. He won't let you leave either." I felt the room tilt slightly, as though the house itself had leaned in closer to hear her words. Then from upstairs, the familiar tapping began again, slow, steady, rhythmic. Eliza flinched, clutching her arms as if to hold herself together. "He's listening," she said, her voice barely audible, and in that moment, I understood the truth. Timothy didn't just live in that house, he was the house. By dawn, I could no longer endure the suffocating air of the Caldwell estate. Eliza's words rang in my head like a curse. "He won't let you leave either." I told myself it was madness, the kind that came from sleepless nights and whispered stories in shadowed rooms. But I had to try. I packed my journal, my medical case, and every ounce of reason I had left, then made my way to the front door. The house was silent, too silent. Even the usual tapping from Timothy's room had stopped, as though he was holding his breath, waiting. I turned the key in the lock, the sound loud and sharp in the heavy quiet, and pushed the door open. The morning air outside was cold and gray, but it felt like freedom. I stepped out onto the porch, my boots striking the old wooden boards, and for the first time in days, I let myself believe I might actually leave. The path to town stretched out before me, empty and lined with skeletal trees that clawed at the sky. I walked quickly, my breath fogging the air, my bag heavy at my side. But the farther I went, the more the world around me shifted. At first it was small things. A fence post I could have sworn I'd passed already, a crooked oak tree that seemed to appear again and again, no matter how far I walked. I quickened my pace, my heart pounded, and then, after what felt like an hour, I saw it, the Caldwell estate, rising from the fog ahead of me. I stopped dead. It was impossible. I turned around, retraced my steps, and kept walking in the opposite direction. But no matter which path I chose, left through the woods, right along the old creek road, I always ended up back at the rusted iron gate. The house was pulling me back, I stood there in the chill, my breath ragged, staring at the black windows, like the eyes of some patient predator. Then slowly, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of those windows wasn't empty. Timothy was standing in the upstairs hallway, his silhouette perfectly still against the glass. He didn't move. He didn't wave. He only watched. I staggered back, shaking my head, but when I turned to run, I nearly collided with Eliza. She was standing just behind me, her face pale and expressionless, as if she had been waiting for this very moment. "You see now," she said softly, "we don't leave. Not ever. He won't allow it." I wanted to argue, to scream, to do anything but accept what she was saying, but I couldn't. The air around the estate felt thicker now, as though invisible hands had closed around me and were guiding me back toward the door. My legs moved on their own, each step heavier than the last. When I crossed the threshold again, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. The sound of the lock sliding into place was deafening. Upstairs, the tapping started once more, this time faster, sharper, almost triumphant. I looked at Eliza, my voice breaking. "Tiz, has anyone ever made it out?" Her silence was answer enough, and from somewhere above us, Timothy laughed. The night after my failed attempt to leave, the Caldwell estate began to change. At first I thought it was exhaustion, or some cruel trick of the mind, but the longer I stayed awake, the more I realized the house was shifting. Its walls groaned with a sound like strained wood, and the air carried a low hum that never stopped, not even when I pressed my hands over my ears. I wandered the halls, lantern in hand, and found doors where I swore there had been none before, narrow, crooked doorways that opened onto empty closets or staircases that went nowhere. The wallpaper peeled back in strips, revealing faint carvings beneath the same jagged circles Timothy drew again and again. Some were so old the wood had splintered around them, as though they'd been burned into the walls by something that wasn't human. Eliza avoided me now. She moved through the house like a ghost, silent and deliberate, her eyes always fixed on the floor. Once I caught her standing before one of those carved circles with her hand pressed against it, her lips moving in a whisper I couldn't hear. When I asked her what she was doing, she didn't answer. She only turned and walked away, her face pale and empty. It was shortly after that I noticed the stairs. The grand staircase that led to the second floor was different now, longer, steeper. I climbed it slowly, lantern raised, counting the steps, 32. But the day before there had been only 20. When I reached the top, I was breathless, my legs trembling, and yet, the hallway ahead was the same, except for one detail. Timothy was standing at the far end. He didn't move, he didn't blink. He only watched me with those black, hollow eyes. I wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but my voice wouldn't come. The house was too quiet, too heavy. Then slowly, he raised one hand and pointed, not at me, but at the floor beneath my feet. I looked down. The boards were carved with dozens of those same jagged circles, etched so deep the grooves seemed to swallow the lantern light. I staggered back, and when I looked up again, Timothy was gone. I fled to my room, locking the door and shoving the chair against it. I told myself I would leave at dawn, but I already knew it was a lie. The house was no longer just walls and floors. It was alive, and it was closing in on me. Later that night I heard it. Not the tapping, not the whispering. This was worse. A sound like wood bending and splitting, as if the house itself were breathing. I pressed my ear to the door and heard the faintest sound of footsteps, small, deliberate, and impossibly slow, circling just outside. I didn't open the door. I didn't dare. I only sat in my chair, clutching my lantern until morning, praying I wouldn't hear the latch turn. When dawn came, I found something new. On my door, scratched deep into the wood, was a fresh circle, and this one wasn't empty. In its center was a single black handprint. I didn't leave my room until the sun was high enough to burn the shadows from the hall. Even then I moved carefully, lantern in hand, as though daylight was no guarantee of safety inside the Caldwell estate. The black handprint carved into my door had not faded. If anything, it looked darker now, as though it had sunk deeper into the wood overnight. When I found Eliza in the sitting room, she didn't look at me. She sat by the window, her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles were bone white, staring at nothing. I told her about the handprint. She only nodded, as though it were an expected development, rather than an alarming one. "You've seen him now," she whispered. "Not the boy, the thing that wears him." I froze. "What do you mean?" She finally turned her head toward me. Her eyes looked hollow, as if sleep had abandoned her years ago. "Timothy died the day he was born," she said flatly. "I knew it when I held him. He wasn't breathing, his skin was cold." And then, her hands trembled. Something came into the room. I didn't see it, but I felt it, like the air had been pulled from my lungs. And then he opened his eyes. I wanted to argue, but the memory of those eyes silenced me. That impossible, endless blackness, the way they pulled at me like a tide. "Eliza," I said carefully, "what is he?" She laughed then, a brittle, broken sound. "He's not my son," she said. "Not really. He wears Timothy's face because it's easier that way. But sometimes, if you look long enough, you see what's underneath." Her words rooted in me like a splinter. To that night, I couldn't help myself. I went to Timothy's door. The house was quiet except for the soft hum that always seemed to come from its bones. The door was ajar, just enough for me to see him. He was sitting in his chair, as always, but something was different. The tilt of his head was sharper, his smile thinner. I felt it then, a pull, not from his face, but from his eyes. I stared too long, and I saw it. For a fraction of a second, Timothy's face melted away like smoke. In its place was something formless and black, a shape that shifted as though it had too many limbs and none at all. Its mouth was wide, stretching where no mouth should be, lined with teeth that weren't teeth but jagged slivers of shadow, and then it was gone. Timothy's face was back, smiling faintly as though mocking me for seeing what I wasn't meant to. I stumbled backward, slamming into the wall. My lantern nearly fell from my grip. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, my voice locked inside my chest. From behind me, Eliza's voice broke the silence. "Now you understand," she whispered. I turned to her, my mouth dry, but she wasn't looking at me. She was staring past me at Timothy, and he was smiling wider than I had ever seen before. That night, I barred my door with everything I could find, my chair, my desk, even my medical case wedged against the frame. I told myself it was foolish, that no child, no matter how strange, could pass through a locked door. But deep down, I knew I wasn't protecting myself from a boy. I was protecting myself from the thing that wore his face. The house was silent at first, not the ordinary quiet of an empty home, but that suffocating stillness that seemed to press in on the walls until even my own breathing felt like an intrusion. I sat in the dark, lantern burning low, my journal open but untouched. I couldn't write. I couldn't think. All I could do was wait. And then it began. The first knock came at midnight, a slow, deliberate tap against the wood of my door. 3 knocks, measured, precise. I froze, every muscle in my body rigid. My hand tightened around the lantern handle, but I didn't move. Silence followed, long enough for me to believe it was over. Then came the second knock, louder this time. 3 more. The sound carried through the wood and into my bones. I bit down on my lip to keep from crying out. I heard the floorboards creak, not in front of my door, above it. Something was crawling across the ceiling. The sound was faint but undeniable, the scrape of nails dragging slowly across the wood overhead. I backed into the corner of the room, lantern shaking in my hand. The knocking returned. Faster now, no longer patient. 3 knocks. Then 3 more. Then 3 more. The rhythm was wrong, too perfect, like a sound that didn't need hands to make it. Eliza hissed through the darkness, but there was no answer. No footsteps in the hall. No one else in the world but me and the thing outside my door. And then from just above the knocking came a whisper. Not words, just the sound of breath, long and steady, dragging through the cracks of the wood. It was so close I could feel it, warm and damp against my skin. I clutched the lantern tighter and pressed my back into the wall. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently I thought it might burst. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it all stopped. No knocking, no breathing, no sound at all. I stayed frozen, afraid to move, until I heard a new sound, something soft sliding against the door. I leaned forward just enough to see it, a handprint, black, spreading slowly across the wood, as if burned there by something unseen. And in the center of the handprint, one word appeared, carved deep and jagged into the wood. Stay. My breath caught. My lantern flickered. Then, for just a moment, I swore I heard laughter, quiet, childlike, and impossibly close. When dawn came, the handprint was gone. The word had vanished, but I didn't need proof. I knew it had been real, and I knew this house, this thing wearing Timothy's face, was no longer just watching me. It was playing with me. By the next night, I realized the Caldwell estate was no longer merely haunted. It was alive. I first noticed it in the study. I had been sitting at my desk, trying to write down everything I'd seen, when the wallpaper shifted. At first I thought it was a trick of the lamplight, but then I saw it ripple, subtle but undeniable, as though something beneath the surface of the walls was moving. I pressed my hand against it. The paper was warm. Then it exhaled. The air pushed against my palm in a slow, steady pulse, the way a chest rises and falls in sleep. I stumbled back, knocking over my chair. The walls stilled, silent again, but I could no longer unsee it. This house was no longer made of wood and nails. It was something else, something that was watching me. I fled into the hallway, desperate for proof I was still sane, but the house was changing there too. The floorboards stretched, groaning beneath my feet. The doors were not where they had been before. One was missing entirely, replaced by unbroken wall, while another now stood at the end of a hallway that should have been empty. I followed it. God help me, I followed it. The door was smaller than the others, almost child-sized, with no handle, but carved into it was a single jagged circle, deep enough to catch the light of my lantern. Don't. Eliza's voice cut through the air, sharp and trembling. She stood at the top of the stairs, her face pale and hollow. If you open it, you'll never come back. I turned to her, but before I could speak, a sound rolled through the house. Breathing. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It came from everywhere. The walls, the floors, the ceiling. Each exhalation rattled the glass of the windows and stirred the flames of the lanterns. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe myself, as if the house was stealing the air from my lungs. And then, from down the hall, Timothy appeared. He didn't walk. He didn't emerge from a door. One moment the hallway was empty. The next he was there, standing perfectly still, head tilted slightly to the side. His black eyes gleamed like polished stone, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. The walls pulsed behind him, the jagged carvings in the wood twisting and deepening, like open wounds. Timothy raised one small hand, and dragged his finger slowly across the wall, leaving a trail of blackness that spread like veins through the wood. The house was responding to him. Eliza grabbed my arm, and yanked me back toward my room. Don't look at him, she whispered. If you look long enough, the house will let him in. We slammed the door behind us, and shoved the chair against it. My hands shook so violently, I could barely hold the lantern. I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but I couldn't, because even as we stood there in silence, I heard it, faint, wet and steady, the sound of the walls breathing, and in that moment, I knew we weren't living inside the house anymore. The house was living around us. By the next morning, the Caldwell estate was no longer merely shifting, it was rotting from the inside out. The walls were streaked with dark lines that looked almost like cracks at first glance, but as I traced them with the lantern light, I saw the truth. They weren't cracks, they were veins. They spread through the wood like a living network, pulsing faintly, as though carrying something beneath the surface. I touched one, and it was warm, too warm. It felt like touching flesh. I recoiled instantly, wiping my hand against my coat as though I could rid myself of the sensation, but I couldn't. Eliza found me in the hallway, staring at the veins. She didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked resigned. "They're his," she said softly. "Every line, every mark. The longer he stays, the deeper he sinks into the bones of this house." I turned to her, my voice trembling. "What happens when it reaches every wall?" Her silence was answer enough. That night I followed one of the black veins. I don't know why. I told myself it was for understanding, but deep down I think I just couldn't stop myself. It led me to the locked room, the one where I had first seen the ropes and the carved circles, only now, the door was already open. Inside, the walls were nearly black with veins, and in the center of the floor, where the old wooden chair had once been, there was something new. A patch of darkness, circular and perfect, as though the floor itself had been hollowed out. It didn't reflect the lantern light. It didn't even seem to belong to this world. Timothy was standing beside it. He didn't look at me at first. He simply stared down into that hole, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Then, slowly, his gaze shifted to me, and for the first time since I had arrived, he smiled wide enough to show his teeth. I couldn't move. The house seemed to tighten around me. The veins in the walls pulsed harder, faster, until it felt like the entire estate had a single monstrous heartbeat. And then I heard it. From the black circle on the floor, something whispered. It wasn't a voice I could understand, but it was low and wet and unending, like words being dragged through mud. Timothy's smile widened. He reached one hand toward the hole, and for a moment, God help me, I saw something reaching back. I stumbled out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My chest burned with panic. When I turned, Eliza was standing there, her eyes hollow. "You saw it, didn't you?" she whispered. I nodded. I couldn't even speak. "That's how it starts," she said. "The veins are only the beginning. When they reach the heart of the house, there'll be nothing left of it, nothing left of us either." And then, for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes, not the quiet dread she always carried, but something raw and final, because she knew, and now so did I. The house wasn't dying, it was growing. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The black circle in that room haunted me, even when I closed my eyes. Every time I tried to sleep, I saw it, a perfect unnatural void, its edges sharp and absolute, like it didn't just exist in the house, but had been carved out of the world itself. By the second night, I couldn't fight the pull anymore. Lantern in hand, I returned to that room. The door was open again, as if the house wanted me there. The black veins on the walls seemed thicker now, almost alive, twitching faintly beneath the wood, like worms beneath thin soil. The circle was waiting for me. I approached it slowly, every step heavier than the last. My lantern's flame flickered the closer I got, until it seemed to shrink away from the darkness entirely. I knelt at the edge, and peered inside. It didn't have a bottom. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but the longer I stared, the more I understood. It wasn't just deep, it was endless. A hole that wasn't a hole but an absence, a place where the rules of the world had been stripped away. and then it moved. A ripple passed through the darkness, like something beneath the surface had stirred. I stumbled back, clutching the lantern tight, but I couldn't look away. Shapes shifted inside it, long, spindly forms, twisting in silence, and then an eye opened, black, vast, staring directly at me. I fell back against the wall, my breath caught in my throat. From somewhere behind me, a sound rose, soft, steady tapping. I turned. Timothy was standing in the doorway. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply tilted his head toward the circle, and then back to me, as if urging me closer. "No," I whispered. My voice was barely audible, even to myself, but Timothy only smiled. The black veins around the circle pulsed faster, as though they were feeding off my fear. And then, from deep within that hollow darkness, I heard it again. Those whispers, that sickening sound of something ancient and hungry speaking without words. Eliza appeared behind Timothy. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a kind of grief that looked older than she was. "Don't go near it," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not a hole. It's a door." I looked back at the circle, and for one impossible moment, I understood exactly what she meant. Because the eye inside it didn't blink, it waited. I staggered out of the room, slamming the door shut so hard the walls shuddered. Eliza caught my arm and pulled me away, whispering so fast it was almost desperate. "If you listen long enough, it calls you. That's how it takes people. That's how it took Thomas." I didn't answer. I couldn't, because even as we left that cursed room behind, I could still hear it. The circle wasn't silent. It was breathing. The next night, I woke to the sound of wood splitting. At first, I thought it was a dream, but when I opened my eyes I saw it, a faint black glow seeping out from beneath the door of the locked room. The circle was waking up. I grabbed my lantern and crept through the hallway. The house was trembling, subtle but constant, like it was holding back a scream. The veins that had once been confined to the walls now spread across the floorboards and ceiling, thick and pulsating, their rhythm matching the pounding of my heart. When I reached the room, the door was wide open. The circle had grown. It now consumed nearly the entire floor, its perfect edge touching the walls, as though it were devouring the room itself. That black glow, neither shadow nor light, poured from it in waves, and Timothy was standing at its center. He wasn't falling. He wasn't standing on anything at all. He hovered, weightless, his feet just above the surface of the darkness, his head tilted back, his mouth slightly open, and from it came a sound I will never forget, a deep guttural hum, inhuman, and resonant enough to make the air quiver. "Eliza," I whispered. "What is he doing?" She was behind me, clutching the doorframe, her face pale and wet with tears. "He's feeding it," she said, her voice hollow. "He's letting it through." Before I could move, the circle rippled. Something inside it shifted, a shape rising like a shadow in water. It pressed against the surface, stretching it thin, and for an instant I thought I saw its face, if you could call it that. A more endless and jagged, limbs that weren't truly limbs, eyes, dozens of them, opening and closing in the dark. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my lantern. The room smelled of iron and rot, a scent that didn't come from this earth. Timothy's head turned toward me then, slowly, mechanically, his black eyes locked onto mine, and his mouth curved into a smile too wide for his face. The hum stopped, and then the circle opened. A sound like tearing flesh and cracking stone erupted from it, as the edges split wider, the veins in the walls pulsing violently. Cold wind poured out, carrying whispers that clawed at my mind, words I couldn't understand but felt in my bones. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs refused to move. Eliza grabbed my arm. "Don't look," she screamed, pulling me away from the doorway. But I looked anyway. Something was climbing out. A hand, if it could be called that, rose from the circle, long and skeletal, its fingers bending in ways that defied human anatomy. It gripped the edge of the floor, wood splintering under its strength. Another followed. The circle wasn't a door. It was a mouth, and it was opening wider. I tore myself from Eliza's grip and slammed the door shut. But even as I did, the black glow seeped through the cracks, and from the other side, I heard Timothy's voice for the first time. He whispered one word, soft and sharp, like a blade sliding through silk, "Stay." And I knew then, with a sickening certainty, that I no longer had a choice. The night it happened, the air in the Caldwell estate felt different, heavier, thicker, as if the house itself had sealed off the world outside. The windows no longer showed the pale dawn or the skeletal trees of Hollow Creek. Instead, when I dared to look out, I saw nothing but black, a void as endless as the circle in that room. Eliza and I barricaded ourselves in the study, but it didn't matter. The walls were shifting again, groaning like something deep within their bones was waking up. The veins were everywhere now, coiling over every inch of wood and creeping across the floor in jagged webs. They pulsed faintly, almost rhythmically, and with every pulse I heard it a low throbbing sound like the heartbeat of some colossal beast. And then came the knocking. Not at my door this time. All around us. Every wall, every floorboard, every ceiling. 1,000 knocks at once, rattling through the house, like skeletal hands, begging to be let in. Eliza clutched my arm, her nails biting into my skin. "Too late," she whispered, her voice raw. "He's waking it up. He's letting it swallow us." The floor beneath us shuddered violently. Books tumbled from the shelves, scattering across the floor like panicked birds. I grabbed the lantern and pushed against the barricade, but when I opened the study door, the hallway beyond was gone. In its place was nothing but black, a vast yawning void stretched out beyond the threshold, and floating in the center of it was Timothy. He hovered there like a puppet with its strings cut, his head tilted, his mouth stretched in that terrible, unnatural smile, and behind him, rising from the darkness, came the thing from the circle. It didn't have a single shape. Its form writhed and shifted, a mass of limbs and teeth, and countless, lidless eyes that stared without blinking. It didn't crawl into the house. It was the house. Every wall, every floorboard, every breath of cold air was part of it. The Caldwell estate was not a home. It was its body. I felt the floor tilt beneath my feet, pulling me toward the blackness. I grabbed Eliza's hand, but her grip was weak, trembling. "If we fight it," she said, her voice breaking, "it'll only take longer." I refused to believe that. Tay pulled her back, forcing the door shut, but it didn't matter anymore. The walls were splitting open, the black veins tearing wider to reveal that same void beneath. The air smelled of decay, heavy and metallic, and I could hear Timothy's laughter echoing through the beams. Then the study door behind us slammed shut on its own. The locks clicked into place. Eliza collapsed to her knees, sobbing into her hands. I stood there frozen, staring at the walls as they began to breathe. Each exhale rattled the glass, and with every inhale, the room grew darker. The lantern's flame flickered, then died, and we were left in nothing but the sound of that monstrous steady breath. And then from the blackness all around us, Timothy's voice came. "Stay." The floor gave way. I didn't fall into the basement. I fell into the circle, into that infinite dark, and as the house closed around me, I realized the truth. The Caldwell estate didn't just keep us in, it was feeding.